Make sure you guys hit the subscribe button if you guys are enjoying the content that we're throwing up. And make sure you guys hit the like button if you enjoy the video. And yeah, let's begin. Okay, so we are getting into not really the conclusion so much as near the end of The Boys. And we're covering the origin of Billy Butcher. Now, originally, I planned on covering this earlier in the story, but as I started reading through, I was like, no, I want to kind of do it all at one time, or kind of do it in the order that it came out, because I feel like it sort of kind of makes the story more interesting in terms of like wrapping back around and kind of builds mystery over the course of everything running up to this, because it's kind of like, what's Billy Butcher's motivation and what's the story behind his character, right? Like, how did he get to where he is now and become the person that he was? I felt like it was kind of cool, right? But what this does is this picks up in 1982 in what was called the Falklands War, right? Now, the Falklands War was a 10-week-long conflict. In the real world, it was a 10-week-long conflict between Argentina and the United Kingdom. And the idea behind this was that the Falklands were basically invaded by Argentina, who really saw it as more of them taking back lands that already belonged to them, so kind of reclaiming what was rightfully theirs, whereas the British, who had basically owned, for lack of a better word, the Falklands territory since 1841, saw it as Argentina invading their territory. The result is that Billy Butcher was part and parcel to this conflict. Now, it wasn't a great big huge thing, and that's kind of interesting that he wasn't really part of World War II or Vietnam proper or anything like that. He's just part of kind of like this skirmish that exists out there that only ever lasted 10 weeks, right? But the idea behind this is that immediately it's kind of shown right off the bat that the guy's pretty hardcore. Now, in terms of how this kind of unfolds, we sort of end up switching over, right? When he basically, mans a machine gun basically on the side of what looks like a warship, ends up taking out this fighter plane, then what we end up doing is jumping to the fact that he's basically talking to his father who passed away. And so what it does is it jumps back to Billy Butcher as a little kid. And Billy Butcher was raised in an almost sort of Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde situation, insofar that his father was exceedingly abusive, but his mother was exceedingly nurturing, right? She was a very, very soft and kind person, and his father was very hard and cruel, insofar that his father actually beat on his mother routinely. And the result of this is that it made Billy Butcher tough and rugged. And the reason why was because the desire to do something really flew in the face of the ability to do anything. And so like a lot of children who have been in this situation where they were in abusive households, his anger and irritation manifested in other ways, right? It sort of drove him to act out in other ways that weren't overly obvious in terms of what was going on at home, right? So there's one instance where he's basically playing with a cross and Jesus and like going on about who's Spartacus basically. And ultimately ends up, when one of the teachers tells him to stop, he tells her to off, right? So that of course ends up landing him in trouble. And then his mother kind of nurtures him, right? Instead of providing a kind of disciplinary hand and saying like, why would you do that? And punishing him. Instead, she kind of doesn't really say it's okay that you did that, but it's kind of like, there's other ways to deal with things. This kind of goes a little bit further as he gets older and ends up getting into a fight with another kid. And then when the PE teacher shows up to break up the fight, ultimately the kid, he ends up punching the PE teacher. Now, in this instance, his father responds, and it's designed to kind of juxtapose the way in which his mother and father dealt with essentially similar situations, which was Billy Butcher acting out. Now, aside from putting his hands on his wife, which of course a man should never beat his wife, Billy Butcher's father here is not entirely wrong, right? He's not entirely wrong here. And the reason why is because what he says is, yeah, I mean, you probably shouldn't have punched a PE teacher, but hey man, at least you let people know that they cannot give you a hard time. And that's kind of an important thing to understand, right? Bullying is being inoculated, right? It's inoculation for the real world, that the real world can be very harsh. And bullying teaches you not to let other people pick on you, right? To stand up for yourself and to basically give back what other people give you. And at the end of the day, if you have to choose between being suspended from school or self-respect, you choose self-respect because that will last you a lifetime. Suspension's only ever temporary, right? And so the result of this is that Billy initially kind of takes this to its most logical conclusion, seeing his father for what he is and seeing that the only way his father is going to stop is if he's removed from the equation. Billy Butcher goes to get a knife with the intention of killing him. Now at that point, Lenny steps in and then Billy Butcher ends up backhanding his brother, and then seeing his brother's face all bloody makes him kind of draws the depiction of his mother being bloody, right? So it almost kind of throws Billy into the position of him being his father, his brother being his mother, and then father beating on his mother. And so this kind of allegory, this sort of depiction of how Billy sees himself in relation to his dad drives him to stop, right? Because the goal is not to become his father. And that's when Billy really begins to kind of turn things around to a degree and actually goes as far as to join the military, right? And so that's during this 10-week long conflict. And it's kind of interesting because when he thinks about this, he actually actually goes to visit his grandfather and says, hey, like, I'm thinking about, joining the military and I want to get medals just like you, and almost kind of romanticizes the idea of war, right? And that's what most people do. Most people in the United States romanticize the notion of war. They watch movies like Pearl Harbor and The Big Red One and Tora 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 and Saving Private Ryan, and they say, wow, look at that, going overseas and fighting bad guys and things like that. And then they get into it. They get into the thick of it and they realize just how horrible it really is, right? So they really kind of bring that sort of torment, that lifelong torment and turmoil onto themselves by falsely romanticizing an ideology, right? And so the result of that is that that's what Billy Butcher's grandfather tells him. You don't want to be in war. You are going to see things that you cannot unsee for the rest of your life. It'll totally ruin you as a human being. But Billy Butcher, romanticizing the idea of war, ends up joining the conflict anyway. And that's where Billy Butcher shows himself as being completely different. That were wartime conflicts, where killing all kinds of people from Argentina, doing things like throwing a smoke grenade and then charging an Argentine bunker, and then really while they're spraying wildly into the smoke, where some of the members of his platoon end up getting shot to pieces, he just kind of charges through, right? He's just kind of like gung-ho, and just starts massacring people. It doesn't really affect him, right? Even the idea of him basically being shot and potentially even dying doesn't really affect him the way that you would expect it to, right? He's not like totally screwed up in the mind. It hasn't warped his entire perspective. He doesn't suffer from PTSD. He has not fallen into a state of depression. Instead, he's just kind of like, these are things that I did. A lot of this, I would say, is a result of the upbringing of Billy and seeing the kind of violent environment that he was in, that while a husband beating his wife cannot really be equated to a wartime conflict, what it did is it created a kind of stepping stone so that once Billy Butcher got to this part of his life, that it didn't really affect him as much as it would some kid from Heartland America who's, by golly, always been helping his dad with the hay and feeding the horses and things like that. And he joins the military because it's the only way for him to get an education, who's totally shielded from the world. The result of that is that when he gets back, what he ends up running into are all these guys who are newly enlisted in the military and have never really seen war, or the various people out there who romanticize war and are just like, tell us more stories, man. Tell us stories about what it was like in conflict and so on. Billy Butcher kind of freaks out at one point, takes a glass and smashes it through the mouth of another guy, and then absolutely pummels the rest of these guys, right? It's all these things where his life kind of takes this downward spiral, right? Being court-martialed, just these things where he really just kind of seems to tumble down. And that's where this is. His life is just kind of falling faster and faster, seemingly out of his control. There's one point where he runs into a bar and just says, I'm going to take out everybody here, and ends up getting the hell beat out of him. It's just one thing after another, searching for conflict, searching for trouble, almost like it's a mission to kind of get himself killed. And this is where he ends up running into Rebecca on a subway train. Now here's something that I'd like to have somebody explain to me in the comments section. And for those of you guys in England, what's the difference between the subway and the tube? What's the difference between those two things, right? Because in the States, all we have are subway trains. And I mean, you've got straight like Amtrak trains, but Amtraks are surface trains that take you from one part of the country to the next. I'm pretty sure there's trains that'll take you from like Houston to, I don't know, North Richland Hills in Texas, which is probably like a 7 or 8 hour drive because the United States is colossal, and that's just in the state of Texas. For those of you guys who don't live in the States, the United States is insanely huge. If you drove from Los Angeles, California, all the way up to Maine, and let's say that you made that drive without stopping, it would take you about 48 hours, about 2 straight days of nonstop driving to get up to Maine. The US is huge. It's insane. But if you drove from Seattle all the way down to Key West, Florida, it would take you about 51 hours, right? So it's kind of nuts. So somebody explain that to me. But he ends up coming across Rebecca. And Rebecca is this woman that comes to him at this point in his life when he is at his lowest point, or seemingly at his lowest point. She's kind of like this bright shining star, right? That's really kind of what she is at the moment. And it's a way for him to kind of be brought back from this path of self-destruction, because that's where he is, right? For example, one of these instances, he basically ends up getting a beer with her. The two of them kind of talk and so on, and really seem to hit it off. And he says, well, I'm going to go get some more alcohol, and then I'm going to beat the hell out of these guys and tell them to be quiet so we can talk. And the response of Rebecca is, no, like don't do that. Just chill. And there's one point where he goes to get some more alcohol, and she says, no, you shouldn't drink anymore. And when he asks why, she says, well, you just told me about this lifestyle you've been living where you've been getting into fights, things like that. You've really kind of turned to the drink. And then you start telling me about how your father was essentially the same way. It sounds to me like you're becoming your dad. And she really kind of has the kind of expertise to draw these conclusions, right? Because she works as a social worker. So she sees this kind of thing all the time. But she's one of these women where she really is better for him, right? She's inherently good for him because she really kind of helps to make him and bring him back, but make him into his best self. And in reality, Billy Butcher starts to fall in love. And we start to see this really kind of soft, tender version of Butcher that we haven't seen before. There's one point where it's him and it's Lenny and it's his mother and it's Rebecca, and they're all gathered around the dinner table, and they're having these conversations. They're talking about Rebecca and so on and so forth. And it's kind of interesting, right? Because the father of Billy Butcher has suffered from a couple strokes up to this point, right? So he's not really dead yet, but he's certainly knocking on death's door, and he's not really able to kind of beat his wife in the way that he has before. But Rebecca really chimes in and says that this man that you see, right, where you suffer from this kind of victim's mentality, right, where you're not really able to bring yourself to leave for whatever reason, at the end of the day, the man that you fell in love with is gone. Like, he's not there anymore. There's no romance between the two of you. There's nothing for you to say. You're basically trying to catch smoke with your hands. It's not possible. The only smart thing for you to do here is to leave. And that's a huge moment because neither Billy nor Lenny were able to get his mother out of there. But at the end of the day, it was one of these things where what she needed was kind of an outside factor, right? She needed somebody else to kind of come in there and to basically steer her in the right direction. You know, somebody to say, you are not of sound mind. You're not capable of rational thought on your own, because if you were, you wouldn't stay here. Because you cannot consciously make these decisions on your own, you need someone to steer you towards the right decision. And so at the end of the day, that's exactly what Rebecca does. And that really kind of goes towards the idea that she's an incredible woman. From there, you end up actually having Billy and Lenny and Billy's mother, and then Rebecca showing up on the doorstep of their apartment and her basically saying, I'm leaving, right? You know, the mother of Billy basically saying, I'm leaving. And the father goes to kind of taunt them for a little while, refers to Billy's mother as a different things like that. And Billy goes to initially launch the attack, but of course Rebecca steps in and says, he's not worth it. Don't become him. Again, one of those instances where she sort of pulls him back from the brink. And so it's kind of interesting, right? Because it's one of these things where she says, you're a great man capable of great things. All you have to do is kind of move away from this person that you have been and try to become the best version of yourself, which is what she's been helping him do. And so ultimately, the two of them end up getting married. And it's a beautiful moment because with Billy Butcher finding happiness for the first real time in his life, it's at the same time yanked away by the death of Lenny. And while it is kind of a hard-hitting thing, he does have Rebecca to kind of rely on and to sort of coach him. Now, the reason why I really push and really kind of rely on Rebecca so much and really talk so much about her is that there comes a point where Billy and Rebecca end up going to Miami. And that's when essentially Rebecca, and Billy come across superheroes for the first real time, right? I mean, we can largely assume they've heard of them, they've seen them on TV, different things like that. But to see a live in-person view of the Seven is something that hasn't really happened up to this point. And so the result of that is people are of course enamored, they're excited, they're like, yeah, superheroes, and getting pictures with them, different things like that. And for the most part, Rebecca doesn't really care, right? She's just kind of like, I mean, you're the only man that I'm really worried about, right? Because I mean, I don't know them, I don't care about them. Like, who the heck knows what they're like, in their own time. And so Billy Butcher ends up going for a walk, and Rebecca says she just kind of wants to sleep, just wants to get some rest. And so following that, over the course of the next 3 months or so, Rebecca is exceedingly distant, right? She's very, very distant. She's very shut off. She doesn't really like to be touched or anything like that. She kind of wants to be left alone. Now, the reality is that these are all the hallmark indications of a woman who's a victim of sexual assault: being removed, being pulled away, not wanting anybody to touch her, trying to find a sense of normalcy, believing the world hasn't fallen apart, but at the same time, not wanting to feel like she can be so easily victimized again. And so what ends up happening, Billy Butcher not really knowing what's going on, he ends up hearing some kind of strange sound that comes from next to him in the bed, turns on the light, looks over, and basically this little infant is just like ripped out of Rebecca and is just like floating there in thin air. And probably one of the most horrifying things that I've ever seen. It starts shooting heat vision out of its eyes. I mean, everything starts going nuts, right? It's just like spraying stuff all over the place. Billy Butcher ends up grabbing a lamp and beats it to death, right? Absolutely just smashes the damn thing. And then looking over at Rebecca, Rebecca's dead. It basically ripped its way out of her. And so following that, he really kind of has this sort of snap, right? Vaughn American steps in immediately after that happens. And they basically say, this can go one of two ways. It can be the story that you found out that your wife was pregnant with another lover's baby, and you went insane. You went into this rage and you killed her and then cut her open and ripped the baby out, and you just totally lost your mind, and you're going to spend the rest of your days in prison, and probably, solitary confinement out in Florence, Colorado, or you'll probably just be given the death sentence, or you'll be thrown into a mental institution. Or you can sign this document here. You're not going to say anything to anybody. You're going to sign this document saying, yes, you did these things, this confession more or less, and then everything's going to be okay, right? We'll sweep it all under the rug and it'll all be sorted out. Kind of a way for Vaughn American to basically remove any involvement with regards to any of the superheroes being involved. Now, one thing to understand, Billy Butcher doesn't know the superheroes are involved. Outside of what he saw with that baby shooting lasers out of his eyes and flying in the air, he doesn't really know of any superhero involvement here. And so about as calm as a cucumber, he asks this guy, he says, you're married? And the guy says, yes. And he says, you imagine what it's like to know that you're never going to see her again? And then gouges this guy's eyes out of his head. right? He helps this Vought American representative understand his place in the bigger picture. And so following that, Billy Butcher is like just absolutely has the hell beat out of him. And then he's kind of left there. And then suddenly here comes Greg Mallory. Now, Mallory, of course, as you guys know, was the guy who originally formed the boys team. And showing up here to Billy Butcher, notice this, it's not really like it was with Huey, right? Billy Butcher was capitalizing on Huey's struggle and saying, hey man, like we got a mission to carry out and that kind of a stuff, and almost kind of manipulating Huey in a few different ways. When it comes to Greg Mallory, it's not really like that. It's, yes, he's sort of using this kind of anger that Billy Butcher has, but what he says is, I can promise you vengeance against the person that's responsible for this. But before any of that happens, he basically says, this is your wife's diary. You know, you didn't know about it. And Billy Butcher even goes as far as to say, I didn't know, you know, my wife didn't have a diary. But basically, you know, this, you know, Greg Mallory says, here's your wife's diary, read through it, and then in turn, let me know what it is that you want to do. And reading through this diary, Billy Butcher comes to the realization that when they were in Miami and he had gone for a walk, that the Homelander had shown up in their room and then basically her during the night. And that when he got back, when Billy Butcher got back, you know, she prayed that Billy Butcher would never find out about it because she knew he would go after Homelander and get himself killed. She essentially kept it all to herself. And that's why she ended up dying, because she was by Homelander. In response, Billy Butcher loses his mind and he's just like, open the door, right? He just totally freaks out, right? And immediately goes to Greg Mallory, and Greg Mallory says, if you side with me, it might take years, it might take decades, but I promise you, we will get the Homelander, you'll get your revenge, we'll bring that whole system down around them. And the response of Billy Butcher is, I'm in. Done. And so from there, Mallory basically says, I need you to do everything that I tell you to do. And with their first mission, he basically gives them this assault rifle and says, I need you to go into that house and I need you to kill everyone you can find. And let me tell you guys something, man. Son, it was Judgment Day in this house. Billy Butcher goes running in here with this machine gun and without even saying a word, sprays down everybody. One of the guys is bulletproof. Billy Butcher figures out the guy's eyes aren't bulletproof, shoots him in the eye, and then puts the gun in his mouth and then shoots him through the head, and basically goes through and executes every last one of these guys. He doesn't say a word. He doesn't say anything to anyone. He just goes through and shoots them all. Doesn't answer any questions, no nothing. Leaves the gun there, leaves the casings there, goes into the car with Greg Mallory, basically says, I assume you were trying to send a message, so I left the gun and the casings. They pour a cup of coffee and they ride off. And that's how things go for the next little while, right? For the next few years. It's basically this idea of them traveling through and either taking out and killing superheroes or using them to get information. And that's literally how this whole system works, right? So they come across the legend starts feeding them information, basically saying, here's how these various things unfold. That's where things kind of get bonkers. This is how the boys group ends up forming. And so that's when we kind of cut back to Billy Butcher basically having this conversation with his father's corpse and saying, like, I've made different mistakes over the course of my life, right? I mean, I've made mistakes, I've done bad things, but I've also fallen in love. I fell in love with the greatest of women that I'd ever met and ultimately lost her. And basically what Billy Butcher tells his father is, when I was younger, I had your anger and your wrath in me, right? I didn't want to have children with Rebecca because I didn't want to pass that on. But what I've learned is your vindictiveness, that's all part of me. It's impossible for me to get away from that, right? That's who I am. And so if that is who I am, then why not use it? But I will say this. He's like, at the end of the day, I never did the kind of things that you did. I never laid a hand on my wife. I never abused the people closest to me. And instead of doing what you did and lashing out at people and compensating for your weakness, I am a legit tough guy, right? I fought in wars. I've allowed myself to live and allowed myself to love. And I'm going to go forward doing the same thing that I've always done. And I'm going to take out all these superheroes and then I'm going to get my revenge. And then I'm going to kill Homelander. And so it's kind of his last goodbye to his father. He stands up, whips his out and pisses all over his head. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. If you are new here to Comments Explain, make sure you guys hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, make sure you drop a like, and I will catch you all later. Peace. Okay, I want to give a shout out to Kyle B, David Joseph, Ben, John H, AJ, Matt N, Jeff R, John H, Lean and Mean, which is an awesome name, Jason C, Austin S, Austin H, Joey M, Steven Z, Austin B, Adam K, and Genosis 916. Remember, guys, you can send me messages and I'll run off whatever your message is at the end of the video, so long as there's nothing crazy. But if you want to put a message in there, send me an email, rob@robertjefferson.com. And if you are one of these people who gets shout outs, then I will tack it in there. And yeah, thanks for watching, guys.